Hey everyone, and welcome back to today's video. Today we are going to be discussing the Neil Gaiman situation in quite a bit of detail and having a wider conversation about consent and power dynamics in general. So it's definitely going to be a difficult one, it's going to be a heavy one. If you need to skip this video for whatever reason, that is absolutely fine. I do not mind at all. Please take care of yourself and put your own needs first. So for those of you who don't know, Neil Gaiman is currently a 64-year-old English author who has been accused of SA by a number of women who were either his fans or employees or both. He's best known for his fantasy, short stories, novels, graphic novels, episodes of legendary TV series like Doctor Who, and so much more. He has always been vocal about calling himself a male feminist, and he has been praised in the past for his portrayals of strong women. I don't know. I've always found that a little questionable, but I've still enjoyed his work. I absolutely have. I think he is an excellent writer. Feminist is not the word that will come to mind when I thought of his work, his writing, his stuff, but I thought it was good nonetheless. Why can't I speak today? Yeah, I think you can enjoy a piece of work or several of them while still noticing that it is flawed in various ways, including ways that, maybe it doesn't represent women in the best way in some cases. There is a lot of rape and torture and murder of women and so on. I can think of several of his lesser-known graphic novels where the female characters, if there are any, are reduced to merely like a sexy prop, But his work isn't what we're here to talk about today. We're talking about his actions off the page in the real world. I do have to say though, I've spoken a few times in videos about separating the art from the artist and where is it possible, where is it not, and that sort of thing. And I have to admit that since all this has come to light, I've gone back and reread a bunch of his comics and books that I already owned. And like I say, as much as I want to advocate for separating the art and the artist and saying, yes, it's absolutely possible, and I feel like maybe as long as you're not financially supporting someone who's terrible, then it's okay. I do find that my experience has been tainted. My enjoyment has been tainted. It's really hard to freely enjoy the work of someone who you know is a monster, right? It's like how you read Lovecraft's horror stories and you can appreciate that they're damn fantastic horror stories, but in the back of your mind you're still kind of sat there waiting for him to do or say something racist, and it makes you uncomfortable and you're like, can't fully enjoy this. It's kind of like that here, except you can't quite relax and enjoy the stories as much, knowing that a lot of the times how he was writing about women, we're talking about Neil Gaiman again now, is how he was treating them in real life. And worse. I don't know. Yes, it makes me uncomfortable. I'm struggling a bit. Okay, so let's talk about some of the allegations against him, and as much as I believe women, I have to call them allegations for reasons, A few have come out since July 2024, but the main ones I want to focus on in today's video are the ones that are spoken about in the recent Vulture article, which is titled, "There is no safe word, how the best-selling fantasy author Neil Gaiman hid the darkest parts of himself for decades," written by Lila Shapiro. The whole article is behind a paywall, which is a little bit annoying, so if you want someone who is going to go through it line by line, I recommend you check out Elise's video. I edited that video for her. It's very good. She goes very in-depth. She does not hold back. She's fantastic. And also, I just love Elise. She's a great person. This video is a bit different to hers because I'm doing more discussing and analysing, whereas she is just very in-depth and talking about it all and not holding back. So 2 different videos, same topic, different purposes. I recommend you watch both because, like I say, I think Elise is fantastic. I'll link hers down in the video description along with a load of resources, books you can read if you want to find out more. If you want to find out more about some of the topics I'm discussing, and there's also a lot of links to charities and organizations that can help you if you have been affected by anything we're talking about in this video as well. And also, if you haven't been affected but you just want to go and support those charities, I really recommend doing that. Go and making a donation, volunteering your time, doing whatever you can, So they will be linked in the video description. Right. So the Vulture article starts by introducing Scarlett Pavlovich. She is the main woman who's accusing Gaiman in this article and who has allegedly, I have to say, been severely mistreated by him more than anyone should. Not like she's had it done more to her than anyone else, just no one should have to go through this, is what I'm saying. It's horrific, the things this man has allegedly done to her. So Scarlett met Gaiman through his now ex-wife Amanda Palmer of the Dresden Dolls, and throughout reading this article and throughout this video, I absolutely have to question how much responsibility Amanda has for what happened. Was she too a victim of Gaiman's, or based on some of the things we'll read later in this article, did she know what he was like and either knowingly or unknowingly enabled him? Was she putting these women knowingly in danger? I obviously can't make any definitive statements, but I can give you the evidence and ask questions and let you make up your own minds. So when they met in June 2020, Scarlett was 22 years old and Amanda was 44. Neil would have been around 60 at the time. Scarlett and Amanda met on the street, and the article tells us that on the surface, Pavlovich, that's Scarlett, appeared to be self-assured as well. A local girl, she dropped out of high school at 15 to travel Europe, Morocco and the Middle East on the cheap, pausing in Scotland. It was Pavlovich who approached Palmer on the sidewalk outside of a perfumery. She was surprised when Palmer texted her a few days later. "It's Amanda D. Palmer," she wrote, "your new friend." The article then goes on to note that Amanda is perhaps more famous for her ability to attract a tight-knit and devoted following wherever she goes, and that she's argued in the past there was no distinction between friends and fans. So immediately we have this massive power imbalance that is very obvious, it's clearly going on, and Amanda seems to thrive on this in her own life and her own career. I have spoken before in many videos about how dangerous it can be for celebrities or big influencers to be too close with their fans, to encourage parasocial relationships, to blur that line between fan and friend and take advantage of it. That can be incredibly dangerous for the fans involved. It can absolutely lead to that fan being taken advantage of, and that is undoubtedly what happened here, even before Scarlett met Neil. Amanda was taking advantage of her and taking advantage of this power imbalance between them. Yeah, Amanda absolutely took advantage of a young fan with no family, no support network, who loved her work and had a crush on her, and had had a lot of trauma in the past that made her especially vulnerable. Amanda saw that, took advantage of it, and used her to get free labor. The article goes on to say that over the following year and a half, Palmer and Pavlovich occasionally met for a meal or a drink. Palmer offered Pavlovich tickets to her shows and invited her to parties for the Patreon community at her house on nearby Waiheke Island, that's in New Zealand. Sometimes Palmer asked Pavlovich for favours, help running errands or organising files or looking after her child. Pavlovich was happy to assist. She had a crush on Palmer. She didn't mind that Palmer only occasionally discussed paying her, even though Pavlovich was always strapped for cash. For Pavlovich, who was estranged from her family and without a safety net, Palmer filled a deeper need. And I'll remind you one more time, this woman is a literal millionaire, married at the time to a multi-millionaire. She is still taking advantage of a young, vulnerable woman for free labor. And she didn't need to. She could have paid for this. She could have afforded this more than most people. And she still took advantage. That alone is messed up and goes on for a couple of years. Scarlett kept agreeing to the work, and eventually Amanda offered to pay her for a weekend of work as her 5-year-old son's nanny. She mentioned that this job will require going back and forth between her house and Neil's. This was 2022. Scarlett was now around 24, but still not in a good position in life. She had no real support network, no real home, no real income stream, and she was really reliant on these small bits of paid work from Amanda. Amanda and Neil Gaiman at this point were now separated and living apart, but like I say, they still had this 5-year-old son together. So Scarlett, who'd been living in Auckland, New Zealand, takes the ferry over to the island of Waiheke, where Neil lived. Palmer had arranged for a playdate for the child, so not long after Pavlovich arrived, she found herself alone in the house with the author. For a little while, Gaiman worked in his office while she read on the couch. Then he emerged and offered her a tour of the grounds. A striking figure at 61, his wild black curls threaded with strands of silver. Around 8 p.m. they sat down for pizza. Gaiman poured Pavlovich a glass of rosé, and then another. He only drank water. So immediately, even though she's meant to be there looking after his kid, he's plying her with alcohol while remaining entirely sober himself. That is a predatory move right there. I mean, there's nothing wrong with someone wanting a drink while you're not drinking, but the fact that you're intentionally plying someone with more and more alcohol while not drinking yourself on purpose is a red flag, you know? And the fact that he's doing it while she's meant to be looking after his son later when he gets home, you could argue, you could argue, not saying this happened, but you could argue that it's very clear he didn't care about her being there to do her job, and he simply wanted to take advantage of a slightly drunk woman alone. It could be argued. In this case, there wasn't so much a celebrity fan dynamic, as she wasn't really sure or aware of who Gaiman was or his work too much, but there was one in the sense that A, he was 3 times older than her, B, he was essentially her boss and paying her. I mean, Amanda was too, but they were both her boss, and she was incredibly reliant on this income from them. And C, he is also a much larger man. She is alone in his house, and he is sober while she is drunk. Lots of power dynamics at play there. The article says, Pavlovich had never read any of his work, but she was anxious to make a good impression. After she'd cleaned up their plates, Gaiman noted there was still time before they'd have to pick up his son from the playdate. I've had a thought, she recalls him saying. Why don't you have a bath in the beautiful claw bathtub in the garden? It's absolutely enchanting. Pavlovich told Gaiman that she was fine as she was, but ultimately agreed. He needed to make a work call, he said, and didn't want Pavlovich to be bored. Gaiman led Pavlovich down a stone path into the garden to find an old-fashioned tub with a roll top and walked away. She got undressed and sank into the bath. A few minutes later, she was surprised to hear Gaiman's footsteps on the stones in the dark. She tried to cover her breast with her arms. When he arrived at the bath, she saw that he was naked. Gaiman put out a couple of citronella candles, lit them, and got into the bath. He stretched out facing her and for a few minutes made small talk. He bitched about Palmer's schedule, he talked about his kid's school, then he told her to stretch out her legs and get comfortable. I said no. I said I'm not confident with my body, Pavlovich recalls. He said it's okay, it's only me, just relax, just have a chat. She didn't move. He looked at her again and said don't ruin the moment. She did as instructed and he began to stroke her feet. At that point she recalls a subtle terror. So now not only has he got metaphorical power over her, but he's got her in a physically vulnerable situation too, where she feels she can't escape, she can't get away. Gaiman asked her to sit on his lap. Pavlovich stammered out a few sentences. She was gay, she'd never had sex, she'd been sexually abused by a 40-year-old man when she was 15. Gaiman continued to press. So generally, when a person is faced with a terrifying situation like this, there are 4 ways they may respond. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. There's a great book called Consent Laid Bare by Chanel Contos, which I'm going to be discussing quite a lot in this video and referring back to. And one of the bits I want to talk about for now is that in that book, it discusses these 4 responses in quite a bit of detail. And I think what we can see throughout this entire article is that through many of her interactions with Gaiman, Scarlett was displaying both freeze and fawn responses. Janelle writes that freezing is a common response to being sexually assaulted. The brain pauses to assess the situation and roots out of it. Meanwhile, she writes that fawning is a strategy that we unconsciously learn to get ourselves out of trouble or a dangerous situation. It's acting overly nice in order to survive an ordeal. This could look like fake laughing, fake smiling, letting your rapist drop you home, pretending to lie there asleep next to them, or getting breakfast with them the morning after an assault. She goes on to say that this trauma response is triggered when fight or flight are not options to achieve safety. It's common in women in heterosexual situations of assault, as, speaking in general terms, a man will be stronger and faster, and trying to physically fight or outrun him is not an option, and that's what was going on here. Bearing in mind that Scarlett didn't have the best home life and had previously experienced a lot of trauma in being assaulted in the past herself, bear that in mind when Chanel goes on to say that fawning is common in people with PTSD and in codependent people who already harbour people-pleasing tendencies. If you've lived in an abusive household or had a long-term toxic relationship with a boss or former partner, you may be used to this idea of playing nice to reduce the impact of abuse. So while I've seen some horrible people online wrongly saying about Scarlett's story, or wrongly asking, why did she stay? Why did she keep going back? Why did she just tell him what he wanted to hear? Why didn't she run away or fight him? This is why. It's a fawning response. It's a trauma response. It's very, very common. It makes sense for the situation she was in. Fawning when you're scared to try and make sure you're safe doesn't mean you were consenting to any of it. Scarlett's story gets so much worse after this, as she describes Neil Gaiman physically assaulting her in several ways in the bath before him telling her to, and I quote, call him master. I won't read it out, it's not very nice, but it's in Elise's video if you want to go and watch, and it's also on the article if you want to go read it for yourself. Okay. The article goes on to say that afterwards, Pavlovich crouched down in the water and tried to clean herself off. Gaiman looked at her and smiled. He said, Amanda told me I couldn't have you, but as soon as he'd heard this, he knew he had to have her. God, he continued, I wish it were the good old days where we could both F you. So again, this part makes me question Amanda's role in all this. How much did she really know? I feel like if you have to warn someone to stay away from a vulnerable young woman that they're employing, then surely you know on some level that she's not entirely safe with him. Right? I don't know. I'm sorry, don't make you jump there. Okay, sorry, baby. It also absolutely shows Neil's mindset here. This idea that he knew he had to have her upon hearing he couldn't. It was never about him liking Scarlett as an individual. It was never about them having a consensual relationship. To him, it was all about wanting power, control, and only seeing women, in particular this woman, as an object to play with. You know, he's like a kid with a toy that he supposedly can't have. He wants it, not because he wants that toy, but because he wants the power and control and to have something he's been told he can't. You know, Chanel writes in her book that men are generally not trained to see women as their true peers. Women are often seen as objects. Women can only be made objects when the basic principles of human empathy fail to be applied to them. When the female body can be commodified, exploited, and hurt in the name of male pleasure, how can they be seen as true humans? And this is exactly what we see of Gaiman's behaviour here and throughout the rest of the article. The Vulture article goes on to talk about Neil's work and career and the power he had over fans in general. Women would turn up to his signings dressed in elaborate Victorian goth attire of his characters and beg him to sign their breasts or slip him keycards to their hotel rooms. One writer recounts running into Gaiman at a World Fantasy Convention in 2011. His assistant wasn't around and he was late to a reading. "I can't get to it if I walk by myself," he told her. And as they made their way through the convention side by side, the whole floor of people tilted and slid towards him, she says. They wanted to be entwined with him in ways I was not prepared to defend him against. A woman fell to her knees and wept. People who flock to fantasy conventions and signings make up an inherently vulnerable community, one of Gaiman's former friends, a fantasy writer, tells me. They wrap themselves around a beloved text so it becomes their self-identity. They want to share their souls with the creators of these works. And if you have morality around it, you say no. It was an open secret in the late 90s and early aughts among convention goers that Gaiman cheated on his first wife, Mary McGrath, a private Midwestern Scientologist he'd married in his early 20s. The idea of predators being able to spot and target vulnerable victims is sadly not new. It's very, very common. We see that predators often entwine themselves in communities and groups of people that are kind of known for being vulnerable, so that they can pick out victims. So maybe they'll go and volunteer with kids in the social care system, or in Gaiman's case, they go to these fantasy conventions where they know there are going to be vulnerable women who are essentially easy for him to manipulate, you know? Or sometimes you see predators are just very good at kind of like picking out people who have had previous trauma or who are vulnerable, and kind of targeting them specifically. Like, they're very good at knowing who to target. In her memoir, Consent, Jill, I think it's pronounced Cement, she reflects on her relationship with her, at the time of writing, recently passed husband of 45 years, and how her view of the relationship changed over the years. There were 30 years between them, and they were married a hell of a long time. So when he died, she was in her 60s, he was in his early 90s, I believe, something like that. But when Jill and Arnold first met, she was just 16 and he was 46. They first kissed when she was 17 and he was 47. He was her art teacher. And Jill admits herself in a memoir that she was in a particularly vulnerable position compared to the other students he was teaching. She writes that, "I planned not to bother finishing high school come May. Artists didn't need diplomas. I was an emancipated minor. My single mother had 3 other children to feed." And there's also the dynamic she talks about how her father had abandoned the family a few years before. She had a lot of issues around that and a lot of trauma around it. And she kind of feels now, looking back, that Arnold maybe saw these vulnerabilities in her and took advantage of it. She goes on to write that when she was just 17, "He kissed me. I could have screamed. I could have slapped him. But what 17-year-old is prepared to slap a 47-year-old man she'd fantasized about for the previous 6 months? I fervently kissed him back. I'd imagined his kiss ever since he looked down my blouse. But did I have the agency to consent? The teenage brain is impulsive. There's a mismatch between the limbic system, which is the center of emotion, and the prefrontal lobe, which controls logic and reasoning. California's age of consent is 18. There's a Romeo and Juliet clause in cases of statutory rape that forgives lovers close in age, but obviously that didn't apply here. Did the art teacher's behaviour, the extra attention he gave me in class, the evenings he used my art to demonstrate how the tendons cross over the elbow, the night he looked down my blouse, qualify as child grooming, a term that psychologists use to describe a paedophile's recruitment techniques? And in her book on life experience, it's not just Arnold who did this either. As she got older, and other older men, including lecturers at her university, as they began to find out about her relationship with Arnold and the other things going on in her life, they began to see her as an easy target and go after her too. There were these older lecturers hitting on her, touching her without consent. One man literally locked her in his office and sexually assaulted her. Again, we kind of have to ask, like, is it a thing with predators where they're just that good at picking out who they think are going to be easy targets? If we go back to Scarlett's experience for a moment, and after the initial assault, you might think that she would just run away and never see Gaiman again, but she didn't have the power to do that. She was reliant on Neil and Amanda for a home, an income, and she had no other choice than to stay. Pavlovich was living in a sublet that was about to end. She was broke and hadn't been able to find a new apartment. She'd been homeless at the start of the pandemic, when the perfumery she worked at closed, and had ended up crashing on the beach in a friend's sleeping bag on and off for the first 2 weeks of lockdown. The thought of returning to the beach filled her with dread. She didn't consider reaching out to her own family. Her parents had divorced when she was 3, and Pavlovich had grown up splitting time between their households. Violence, Pavlovich tells me, was normalized in the household. One close family member beat her with a belt. Another would strangle Pavlovich when she got upset and slap her across the face until her cheeks were raw. She regularly began to cut her arms and wrists with a knife when she was 11. She became bulimic, then anorexic. By 13, Pavlovich had grown so thin that she ended up in a psychiatric unit at Auckland Children's Hospital and spent weeks on a feeding tube. When she was 15, she left home and never went back. In the years since, she'd been looking for a new family, but many of the people she'd encountered in that search turned out to be abusive as well. After all of this, Amanda Palmer was an actual creature sent from a celestial realm. It was like, hallelujah, Pavlovich tells me. Palmer was famous for speaking out about sexual abuse and encouraging others to do the same. In songs and essays she'd written of having been sexually assaulted and raped on multiple occasions as a teenager and young woman. Pavlovich didn't think someone like that could be married to someone who would assault women. So this comes back to what I was saying about her being especially vulnerable and Neil kind of seeing that and taking advantage. Some people, again, wrongly, are like, oh, well, if a woman's sexually assaulted once, she's unlucky, but if it happens repeatedly, then it's her fault. And that is just an absolute load of crap. Once a person already has trauma, it can be so much easier for other people to manipulate and control and hurt them, and it's heartbreaking, and it's absolutely not their fault. Is it, babe? No, it's not. Scarlett resorted to fawning over Gaiman repeatedly to try and keep herself safe. The fawning is not a sign of consent, it's a sign that she was petrified and trying to save herself. The article says, after Palmer's offer, Pavlovich texted Gaiman, "I'm consumed by thoughts of you, the things you will do to me. I'm so hungry, what a terrible creature you've turned me into." The following weekend, she packed up her sublet and boarded the ferry to Waikiki. Saying no to him directly had not worked. Pleading with him to leave her alone hadn't worked. She had no physical way to fight back against him. So she felt like if she played along with his games and told him what he wanted to hear, he would treat her better and be less likely to hurt her. Sadly, this didn't work either because there's really no way to win with predators like this, but she had to try something, and she felt like this was keeping her safer than, physically fighting him or running away or whatever, because that wouldn't work. So the article for a while talks about how he seemed to have this really friendly public persona and that no one ever expected he was anything but lovely. However, his mask did slip with some people. There was some who saw another side to the author. One woman, Brenda, a pseudonym, met Gaiman in the 90s at a signing for The Sandman where she was working. On signing lines, Gaiman had a knack for connecting with each individual. A few years later, Brenda travelled to Chicago to attend the World Horror Convention where Gaiman received the top prize for American Gods, the book that cemented him as a best-selling novelist. The night after the awards ceremony, she and Gaiman ended up in bed together. As soon as they began to hook up, the feeling that had drawn her to him, the magical spell of his interest in her individuality, vanished. He seemed to have a script, she tells me. He wanted me to call him Master immediately. He demanded that she promised him her soul. It was like he'd gone into this ritual that had nothing to do with me. In summary of his allegations, the Vulture article states, this past July, a British podcast produced by Tortoise Media broke the news that 2 women had accused Gaiman of sexual assault. Since then, more women have shared allegations of assault, coercion, and abuse. The podcast Master, reported by Paul Corona Galizia and Rachel Johnson, tells the stories of 5 of them. Gaiman's perspective on these relationships, including with Pavlovich, is that they were entirely consensual. I spoke with 4 of those women, along with 4 others whose stories shared elements with theirs. I also reviewed contemporaneous diary entries, texts, and emails with friends, messages between Gaiman and the women, and police correspondence. Most of the women were in their 20s when they met Gaiman. The youngest was 18. 2 of them worked for him, 5 were his fans. With one exception, an allegation of forcible kissing from 1986, when Gaiman was in his mid-20s, the stories take place when Gaiman was in his 40s or older, a period of time when he lived in the US, the UK, and New Zealand. By then, he had a reputation as an outspoken champion of women. Then there's just more and more stories of him taking advantage of people who were fans of his. And this isn't just a matter of like, oh, sorry, I misread this situation and made you uncomfortable. I'm so sorry, let me never do it again. These are stories of him repeatedly going out of his way to manipulate women, lying to them, ignoring their literal pleas for him to stop, and repeatedly overstepping boundaries that he knew were there because they'd told him. Repeatedly. So Catherine Kendall was 22 when she met Gaiman in 2012. She was volunteering at one of his events in Asheville, North Carolina. He invited her to join him a few days later at an after-party for another event where he kissed her. The two struck up a flirtatious correspondence, emailing and Skyping in the middle of the night. Kendall didn't want to have sex with Gaiman, and on one of their calls, she... Oh, baby, careful, you okay? You're safe. Kendall didn't want to have sex with Gaiman, and on one of their calls, she told him this. Afterwards, she recorded his reply in her diary that he had no designs on me beyond flirty friendship, and I believed him thoroughly. At a reading 10 months later, Gaiman suggested that Kendall and 2 of the girls wait for him on his tour bus so they could all hang out after he was done signing. When Gaiman showed up, he pulled Kendall into the back of the bus and lay on top of her. He kept saying, "Kiss me like you mean it." She tried to get into it, but she was panicked. Eventually, Gaiman rolled off her. "I'm a very wealthy man," she remembers him saying, "and I'm used to getting what I want." Years later, Gaiman gave Kendall $60,000 to pay for therapy in an attempt, as he put it in a recorded phone call, to make up for some of the damage. Another story says that Gaiman had been having sexual encounters with younger fans for a long time. Kendra Stout was 18 when in 2003 she drove 4.5 hours to Fort Lauderdale, Florida to see Gaiman read from Endless Nights. She met him in the signing line. Gaiman sent her long emails and bought her a webcam so they could chat on video. Around 3 years later, he flew to Orlando to take her on a date. He invited her back to his hotel room and held her down with one hand. Gaiman didn't believe in foreplay or lubrication, Stout tells me, which could make sex particularly painful. When she said it hurt too much, he'd tell her the problem was she wasn't submissive enough. He'd talk at length about the dominant and submissive relationship he wanted out of me. Stout had no prior interest in BDSM. She says Gaiman never asked her what she liked in bed, and there was no discussion of safe words or aftercare or limits. He'd ask her to call him master and beat her with his belt. These were not sexy little taps, she said. When she told him she didn't like it, she says he replied, "It's the only way I can get off." And I mean, if all of these women have such similar stories of their experiences, despite never having met, never having discussed this before sharing it publicly, then it suggests that they're likely very true, and we're seeing a pattern of behavior for him. You know, these are specific things that he's doing over and over again that multiple women are corroborating. I also want to, at this point, talk for a little moment about his BDSM comment. Later, he also said, so according to the podcast which quoted Gaiman through his representatives, his position was that sexual degradation, bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism may not be to everyone's taste, but between consenting adults, BDSM is lawful. And it absolutely is, but what Gaiman was doing was absolutely not BDSM. Every single person in the BDSM community will tell you that the key to it all is communication and trust. Every single person has to be informed on everything and give prior consent, which can absolutely be revoked at any time. It's as much about the submissive party enjoying it and, in a lot of ways, actually being in control, as it is about the dominant party enjoying it and seemingly being in control, you know? If there's no prior discussion, if the submissive party doesn't have any say in what happens, if there's no consent, no safe words, no aftercare, then it's not BDSM, it's just rape. It is that simple. Neil Gaiman, if these allegations are true, was not getting off to BDSM or just being dominant, he was simply raping women. And there is a massive distinction, I can't believe that even needs saying. This woman tells another story of Gaiman raping her, which is so graphic and disturbing that I will not read it out in this video. Lizzie does cover it in hers, so it's horrifying though. To summarize, she had a very painful UTI, so she told him not to penetrate her at all because she was in pain. He did it anyway, repeatedly with various body parts, and at that point she tells me, I just shut down. She lay on the bed until he was finished. It's sickening, and this is just rape. There is no other word for it. You know, when you're a kid in school, and you're doing like GCSE history, and you're doing like World War II stuff, and everyone's like, yeah, but I don't get it. Hitler was clearly a bad guy. Like, I don't get how people fell for it. I don't get why people liked him. I don't get how he got to power. And now I'm like, well, now we're literally seeing that happening in front of us. Like, this is how it happened before. It's happening again. Except we should have the knowledge this time to not let it happen. And honestly, this time it's like even more in our faces. I don't have the words. I just feel like I'm watching a bunch of idiots doing idiot things, and there's nothing I can do to stop it, and it's absolutely terrifying, right? It doesn't feel real. It's so bizarre. I don't know. Sorry, that was a voice note to Elise and Evangelina Skov, because we're talking about the whole Elon Musk Nazi saluting at the inauguration thing. And apparently people are making an excuse now that he's just an autistic man trying to dab and he did it badly. And Eva was like, Rachel, you're autistic. When you dab, do you accidentally Nazi salute? It's like, funnily enough, no, I don't. Not that I ever dab, but you know what I'm trying to say. It's a stupid excuse for a stupid man who's just evil and stupid, and it's horrifying to like watch all this unfold. Anyway, speaking of horrifying, sorry, Neil Gaiman. Yeah, like I say, this isn't BDSM. He allegedly repeatedly penetrated an ill woman who repeatedly told him to stop and repeatedly told him no. That is rape. And that's not just any rape, but that's rape with malice and forethought, with absolute disregard for her as a human being. That's not okay. Like, the article then goes on to explore Gaiman's childhood, growing up with Scientologist parents and being abused by the church. And it is sad to read. It absolutely is. No child should have to go through that. You guys know how I feel about Scientology in general, and actually, you know what? I don't think I've ever made a full video about Scientology, but I have been thinking about covering, was it Leah, what was her name? Leah Remini? Leah Remini, yeah. I was thinking about covering her book on it. I think it was hers? I don't know, stop my head. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about it now. I need to do more research, but potentially a video on Scientology at some point if they don't kill me first. Yeah, so like, clearly understanding his childhood and seeing all of this, it's just proof that like cycles of abuse are continuing going forward, and it's absolutely horrible. He was abused as a child, now he's abusing others, and I feel like when we read all this stuff, we can absolutely feel sorry for him as a child and what he went through, and be like, oh god, like he's clearly got a lot of trauma. I hope he gets therapy and help. And we can still understand how awful Scientology is and be furious at the church, whilst not using that to excuse his behaviour. It maybe explains his behaviour, but it doesn't excuse it. It doesn't excuse how he treated women. We can still be absolutely furious at that too, and understand that there's absolutely no excuse for his behaviour. Have I made any sense? I hope, right. Then the article goes on for a bit to focus on the relationship between Neil and his now ex-wife Amanda, who, like I say, we've spoken about a little bit so far. So it gives some history here, saying Gaiman and Palmer met in 2018 when she was 32 and he was 47. Both were at a turning point in their lives and careers. Gaiman was in the midst of finalising a divorce from his first wife, with whom he had 3 children, and on the verge of breaking into Hollywood. Palmer was in a fight with her record label that would culminate in a split. So again, it could be argued that there was a massive power imbalance here. The age thing maybe isn't so much of a big deal at these ages, 32, 47, that's fine. But the fact that, like, he was at such a big, powerful point in his career and she was struggling a bit, like, maybe suggests, and they did some, like, work together and stuff, and she kind of needed his help with that. Maybe there was a little power imbalance there. Maybe he had a little bit more power over her there. Who's to say? I don't know. It's not like with his employees and stuff, though. Gaiman was the first to propose a romantic relationship. In an interview, he later said, I got together with her because I couldn't ever imagine being bored. Palmer could. So at the time when they got together, she had no savings and didn't own a car, real estate or kitchen appliances. Gaiman owned multiple houses. He was too rich, too famous, too British, too awkward, too old, and they didn't have great sexual chemistry. But he appeared to be kind and stable, a family man, and they shared a dark, fantastical aesthetic. She also felt a little sorry for him. He seemed lonely in spite of his fame, and Palmer found herself hoping she could help him. He believed for a long time, deep down, that people didn't actually fall in love, she wrote in her book. But that's impossible, she told him. He'd written stories and scenes of people in love. That's the whole point, darling, he said. Writers make things up. All the red flags, right? Like, all of them. And it seems that for a long time they both had an open relationship, which is absolutely fine. They would share partners sometimes, also fine. Again, all fine if they're consenting and adults. But some of the stories seem a little dubious, like when a 36-year-old Amanda picked up a 20-year-old fan at one of her concerts, slept with her, and then essentially just passed her on to Neil. So, again, she's finding someone with whom she has a power imbalance and a massive, age difference with. This person is 20 and vulnerable and a fan, and she's just like, yes, let me sleep with you until I'm bored, and then pass you on to my nearly 50-year-old husband. This was in 2012. So in 2012, Palmer met a 20-year-old fan who asked to be referred to as Rachel at a Dresden Dolls concert. After one of Palmer's next shows, the women had sex. The morning after, Palmer snapped a few semi-naked photos of Rachel and asked if she could send one to Gaiman. She and Palmer slept together a few more times, but then Palmer seemed to lose interest in sex with her. 6 months after they met, Palmer introduced Rachel to Gaiman online, telling Rachel, "He'll love you." The two struck up a correspondence that quickly turned sexual, and Gaiman invited her to his house in Wisconsin. She packed for the trip and asked Palmer to email over if she had any advice for pleasing Gaiman in bed. Palmer joked in response, "I think the fun is finding out on your own." With Gaiman, Rachel says there was never a blatant rupture of consent, but he was always pressing her to do things that hurt and scared her. Looking back, she feels Palmer gave her to him like a toy. So again, I have to ask, how much did Amanda really know? How much was she involved? How much was she aware of? What was her actual role in this? It's creepy as hell. Then there's another story in the article of Neil helping a family friend by providing income and a home, only to completely take advantage, and then threaten to take it all away so he could keep abusing her. It's like, are you seeing a pattern here? You know? One allegation maybe could be fake or false or exaggerated, but when you have so many women having the same thing happen to them by the same man over and over and over again, I just don't see how that could be not true or fake. I know I still have to say allegedly, but I think we all know how I feel. One of the people in whom Palmer confided about her marital issues at the time was Caroline Wallner, a potter who, along with her builder husband Philip, had been living on the Woodstock property that Amanda and Neil owned and working as a caretaker, or I think maybe just Neil owned it. Gaiman had made them an offer that seemed too good to be true. They would build an addition on one of the cabins on the land at Gaiman's expense, and in exchange, Gaiman would sell them a 5-acre parcel, allowing them to put up a barn-style home to share with their 3 daughters. They tended to the garden, ran errands for guests, and rehabilitated the buildings which needed plumbing and electrical work. But their marriage of 11 years was falling apart too. In 2017, Philip moved out of their house. Wallner, 54, spent her days in bed crying and drinking. She stopped eating and for the most part stopped working. It was then Gaiman began paying her attention. He would bring juices up to her cabin and fret she was losing too much weight. The first time he touched her was in December 2018. She was sitting on his couch next to him, crying from exhaustion. Gaiman told her, "You need a hug." She stood and he hugged her, then he slid his hands down her pants and into her underwear and squeezed her butt. She does not recall saying or doing anything in response. "I was stunned," she said, which is a typical freeze response. So even though this woman is older than his other victims, she was still in a vulnerable position. And again, it's like predators can see that, isn't it? Over the next 2 years, they had a series of sexual encounters, always when Palmer was away. When Gaiman wasn't around, they occasionally engaged in phone sex. At first, Wallner, who hadn't been with anyone since Philip left, went along willingly, but at the end of their second encounter, she remembers asking Gaiman what Palmer would think about their romance. He said, "Caroline, there is no romance." And after that, she tried to keep her distance from him, darting away when she saw him on the estate. So, the flight response. He was difficult to avoid. He kept an egg incubator in Wallner's cabin and would come down and check on it, entering without texting first. So he's just barging into her home without asking, without telling her. She doesn't have a choice in the matter. Then there's another description of an assault, which again I'm not going to read out, but it's followed by nothing changed. Walner had no income at the time and was borrowing money from her sister to get by. She worried that if she didn't appease Gaiman, he'd kick her out of her house, and then she and her 3 daughters would have nowhere to go. I like our trade, she remembers saying to him. You take care of me and I'll take care of you. And there you have the fawning response. So she then tells a story of Gaiman attempting to be sexual with her while his son was literally in the bed between them. Like, sleeping, but in the bed. Again, won't read it out, but he didn't have boundaries, Walner said. I just remember thinking there was something really wrong with him. And again, this is sadly another pattern of behaviour because Scarlett tells a very similar story herself, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. Gaiman finally took back his offer of land and monetary support from Walner, kicked her out of her home, and then tried to silence her with an NDA and paying money for her to get therapy. Again, that's a pattern of behaviour we've seen before. After finding out about the Warner situation, Amanda said, that poor woman, I can't believe he did it again. So again, he did it again. Like, how much did she know? I'm gonna keep asking. I think more people need to be talking about that, to be honest. I mean, she's obviously not as bad as Gaiman, but clearly, maybe she could have, allegedly, played a massive part in it. So the article switches back to talking about Scarlett's experience here, and this next part is so graphic and disturbing and disgusting that I cannot read it out loud. The first time I read this, I actually gagged. It's one of the worst things I've ever heard. If you need to skip this next part of the video, that's fine, go to the next chapter. I absolutely would not blame you, but I will give you a summary, and even the summary is bad. Basically, Neil Gaiman, allegedly, in one instance, anally raped Scarlett in the kitchen while his son was in the house. He used literal butter as a replacement for lubricant, and then made her lick the butter and her own excrement off his private parts. He made her shower while he shoved lavender soap in her mouth. On another occasion, he raped her, causing so much pain she passed out. On another occasion, he made her lick his own urine off of him. On another, he forced himself in her mouth so hard she vomited and then made her eat her own vomit. And then on another occasion, he raped her in a hotel room, literally in front of his son, with only a duvet covering them. It's just the most vile thing imaginable. No. It's unforgivable. So to go back to Chanel Contos's book, Consent Laid Bare, which we spoke about earlier, that book talks about how there's different kinds of people who commit sexual assault. And she says that for some people, it's just a matter of opportunity. You know, she writes that their offences are predatory acts that are unplanned and show poor impulse control. Sometimes with these people, their actions are quite literally a matter of ignorance. They weren't educated in what consent actually means. They're too busy selfishly thinking about themselves to stop and ask what the other person wants. They're a product of a misogynistic society that perpetuates rape culture. And their behaviour is not excusable, and I do not want to downplay the harm these people do. But I feel like, at least in those cases, these people can sometimes learn, reflect on their behaviour, and absolutely change for the better. Because they didn't necessarily mean to cause harm, even though they did. You know, maybe they misread signals, or they genuinely made a mistake. And while their victim doesn't need to forgive them, like, it's entirely up to them, I do personally believe that, like, for a lot of those people, with self-reflection and learning and growth and genuine remorse, they can be better people and won't do it again, you know? And I know it's going to sound controversial, but hear me out here. I believe that every single person accidentally oversteps a boundary at some point in their life. We've all accidentally done something without consent, and I don't mean sexual here, but, like, you know, maybe we've gone in for a hug for someone when they didn't want it without realizing. Maybe we've accidentally shared a friend's secret that they didn't want us to tell. Maybe we've made a joke that oversteps someone's boundaries. Those are us making accidental mistakes, accidentally overstepping boundaries because we weren't socially aware, or we weren't thinking, we were being selfish. And I do believe that those kinds of things are like genuine mistakes that everyone makes, and it doesn't necessarily make someone inherently a bad person. It's kind of just part of being human and part of learning and growing. And I think the important thing is that, like, in those cases, we apologize, we learn, and we do better. And I kind of feel like for some people, they make those mistakes in a sexual way, and it's terrible, it's bad, it's awful, it's inexcusable. But I also kind of feel like there is potential redemption there for people, if that makes sense. And like I say, the victim shouldn't have to forgive them if they don't want. Like, it's not on them, like, they don't have to. But I do believe that at least when people mess up, they can be better, they can do better, they can become better. That's not what's happening in the Neil Gaiman case. I don't believe this is an example of that. He wasn't an opportunistic rapist. He wasn't some silly little boy who misunderstood or misread a situation. He was malicious. However, he is trying to downplay this allegations as, ooh, what a silly mistake. I'm just not socially aware. What a silly, awkward man. And no, absolutely not. So he has released a statement which says, "As I read through this latest collection of accounts, there are moments I half recognise and moments I don't. Descriptions of things that happened sitting beside things that emphatically did not happen. I'm far from a perfect person, but I have never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone ever. I went back to read the messages I exchanged with women around and following the occasions that have subsequently been reported as being abusive. The messages read now as they did when I received them, of two people enjoying consensual sexual relationships and wanting to see one another again. At the time I was in those relationships, they seemed positive and happy on both sides. I also realised looking through them years later, I could have and should have done so much better. I was emotionally unavailable while being sexually available, self-focused and not as thoughtful as I could or should have been. I was obviously careless with people's hearts and feelings, and that's something I deeply regret. It was selfish of me, I was caught up in my own story and I ignored other people's. I've spent months now taking a long hard look at who I've been and how I've made people feel. Like most of us, I'm learning and I'm trying to do the work needed. I know that's not an overnight process. I hope that with the help of good people, I'll continue to grow." And like, if he'd, I don't know, accidentally gone in for a kiss with someone because he misread the signals and he got it wrong, this might be acceptable. If he'd, I don't know, taken a woman back to his hotel room and they'd engaged in a bit of consensual touching and then she'd tried to stop him, but he'd not quite got the message, and then a couple of minutes later he'd been like, "Oh, wait, sorry, oh, no, I overstepped there." If he'd done something like that, this might be an acceptable response. You know, those are genuine mistakes where you maybe overstep but you didn't mean to, and then you apologize and get better and grow. Like, and this would be an acceptable response to that. But that's not what he did. None of that is what happened. He wasn't just some silly little socially awkward man misreading signals. He didn't just make someone a bit uncomfortable once, and he can't get away with that. Well, you know, I still think it was consensual, so I guess I'll just do some learning. He can't do that. This is a case of a 40 to 60 plus year old man repeatedly targeting younger and or vulnerable women that he had power and control over, repeatedly ignoring their literal and verbal pleas for him to stop, degrading them, objectifying them, assaulting them, injuring them, and being entirely aware of what he was doing. He often planned in advance how and when he was going to do this. He would buy them gifts, offer them money and homes, fly them around the world to see him and meet him just so he could hurt them. This is not one silly little mistake of a socially awkward man. This is a manipulative predator, allegedly, repeatedly knowing what he's doing in hurting women. If these stories are true and accurate, and I thoroughly believe they are, this is a pattern of premeditated, aggressive, violent, and degrading behaviour from a man who, like I say, knew exactly what he was doing. His non-apology statement is not enough, and he is a danger to all women. To go back to Chanel's book for a moment, and while I don't want to apply definitive labels to anyone, and, you know, I'm not going to say this is who Gaiman is. I'm just saying, at one point in the book, she writes about what she calls sadistic rapists, as opposed to the opportunistic ones. And I would just say that this could potentially seem like a more accurate description of the actions we've heard Gaiman carried out. She writes that sadistic rapists derive pleasure from being violent and sexually assaulting someone. They've usually been terribly abused as children and are likely to reoffend regardless of rehabilitation measures. It's hard to prevent this type of rapist from perpetuating sexual assault. To prevent this type of rapist, the generational cycle of abuse must be stopped. The Vulture article ends with Scarlett telling the story of how she went to Amanda and told her what Neil had been doing to her and asked for help, and basically got absolutely nothing to help her. Just to remind you, Amanda Palmer is someone who apparently prides herself on being an outspoken feminist who will speak up for women and calls out domestic and sexual violence against women, unless apparently it's her ex-husband doing it. 10 days after Gaiman left New Zealand, Pavlovich went to Palmer's house for dinner. She asked Palmer if she could tell her something in confidence and made her promise not to tell Gaiman. She begged for reassurance that she would still keep her job as the child's nanny. Palmer assured Pavlovich her employment was not in danger. Sitting in the kitchen, Pavlovich told Palmer that Gaiman had made a pass at her. She told Palmer about the bath. I didn't have any choice in the matter, she said. He just did it. She said he'd been having sex with her ever since. She withheld some of the most brutal details, but did not describe her experience as sexual assault. She didn't yet see it that way, which is completely common. Sometimes it takes people off process. Palmer did not appear to be surprised. 14 women have come to me about this, she said. She mentioned that Gaiman had slept with another babysitter during his first marriage, and that she'd heard from other women who were disturbed by their experiences with him. Pavlovich waited until the end to tell Palmer about the child being present in Auckland. Afterwards, she recalled Palmer was silent. She appeared shocked. Palmer insisted that Pavlovich spend the night in her guest room. She told her, I've had to do this before, and I can do this again. I will take care of you. So again, clearly she knew. She knew of at least 14 other women. Not saying anything. Pavlovich received a text from Gaiman saying, Amanda tells me you're having a rough time and you're really upset with me about what we did. I feel awful about this. Would you like to talk about it? Is there anything I can do to make it better? Pavlovich didn't respond immediately. My reflex was to fix the situation, she tells me. The next day she wrote, Hey, we'll speak soon. Hope you're doing good. Scarlett went on to tell a friend about the experience, and this woman's partner was Chris Taylor, a doctor of psychology who had lectured at the University of Auckland on coercion, consent, and rape, and thank God for these friends. Although Pavlovich had never used the word rape or sexual assault to describe what happened to her, both Anaru, the friend, and Taylor believed Gaiman had raped her repeatedly. Anaru felt Palmer bore a share of the blame. Replying to Palmer, she wrote that the majority of my rage is directed at Neil, but she couldn't understand why, with all Palmer knew about Gaiman, she'd sent Scarlett into the situation. Exactly. Did you not see this coming a mile away, she said. And yes, I know you asked him not to do that to her, but honestly, the fact you even felt this was something you should ask is effed up in ways that defy comprehension. Exactly. So at least she had someone looking out for her eventually. Meanwhile, Amanda was getting Gaiman to go to therapy with a therapist called Muller, and Gaiman used something said in these therapy sessions to text Scarlett and try and manipulate her further. So in the session with Muller, Palmer had said that Pavlovich was telling people he'd raped her and was planning to Me Too him. I wanted to kill myself, he wrote, but I'm getting through it a day at a time. It's been 2 weeks now and I'm still here. Fragile, but not great. Like, he said that to Scarlett. Like, you told on me I want to kill myself. Like, that's pure manipulation. He expressed dismay at Anaru's message, which Palmer had told him about. I'm a monster in it, he wrote, and Amanda seems to have bought it hook, line, and sinker. Apologising for bringing any upset into Pavlovich's life, he wrote, I thought that we were a good thing and a very consensual thing indeed. So do you see what I mean? This is not like some silly little mistake that he's remorseful for and learning from. He's manipulating the whole situation, and actually his therapist is helping him. But Scarlett responded to this with fear and began fawning to try and make him happy again, because that's what traumatized people do. The therapist, Neil Gaiman's therapist, spoke to the reporter who wrote this article and said that he'd also gone out of his way to speak to Scarlett too, to try and make everything go away for Neil. It's horrific, this person. Muller, for his part, tells me that ethical boundaries prevent him from sharing anything about his sessions with Gaiman, but he apparently felt comfortable sharing details of his conversation with Pavlovich, Scarlett. What she called to speak to me about was feeling pressured from very diverse, mostly older women in her community, to take action that she wasn't sure she felt comfortable taking. I accompanied her on her journey to help her figure out the answers for herself to that issue. Okay. So basically, he's helping manipulate Scarlett into downplaying her own experience, just like Neil was. You know what? I'm so sick of men like this. And also, Bonnie Blue does it as well. Bonnie Blue does it. Who, when they're called out for doing something that harms people, especially young people, they just start blaming everything on older women. Everything is older women's fault. It's like, ooh, these damn older women. They immediately try and discredit older women because apparently intelligent, self-assured women with power intimidate them. the older women in this story, or in the case of Bonnie Blue, where she's like, the people who are mad at me for, like, you know, cheating on people and spreading STDs, it's just these older women. Like, she did it as well. But these older women are just women who are experienced and knowledgeable, who are finally standing up to misogynists or bad behavior or dangerous behavior or people taking advantage of young people. They're speaking out to try and keep young people safe from harm. And in response, the people who are causing that harm are just turning around, trying to discredit them as just older women, because they want to be able to continue to abuse and take advantage of young, vulnerable people without anyone calling them out. I'm repeating myself, I'm rambling. It's disgusting, is the point I'm trying to make. Following all of this, Scarlett's mental health suffered. Not surprising. And Amanda took back her promise of letting her keep her job and only offered empty statements like, I can't offer you exactly what you want from me, but I can still be here. Remember this. Scarlett replied with, babe, I'm more alone than I've ever been in my life. And she wished she'd never agreed to be their nanny and said, if I hadn't got on that first ferry, I wouldn't be where I am now. The article goes on to say that night Pavlovich texted Gaiman, Amanda keeps saying she'll help me, but it seems more philosophical rather than she will actually help. 2 minutes later she added, I've been thinking of you so much. Gaiman replied that he'd be happy to help in a tangible way. Pavlov received an NDA dated to the first night of her employment when he'd suggested she take a bath. She signed it. A month later, she received a bank transfer from Gaiman. $1,700 for her babysitting work, which is nothing. 2 months after that, she received the first of 9 payments, totaling around $9,200. So again, he fell back into the just trying to silence his victims with an NDA and money. It's disgusting. Disgraceful. Ugh. In January 2023, Pavlovich filed a police report accusing Gaiman of sexual assault. At the station, she gave a formal interview about the case. After she told the officers her story, one of them told her that Palmer's cooperation would be essential for the case to move forward. Pavlovich assured them Palmer would participate. I said to them, she's a public feminist, and she knows what happened. She'll want to protect me. I'm sure she'll speak. When the police contacted Palmer later that year, she declined to talk with them. Gaiman never spoke with the police either. So Amanda Palmer, in my opinion, really does not seem to care at all. Palmer and Gaiman together are awful, awful people. Obviously, Gaiman is so much worse, but they have repeatedly, and allegedly, taken advantage of young women in one way or another, and I just find it absolutely disgusting. Awful. Okay, and that's where the article ends. That's all we're going to talk about for now. But if you'd like to read more about the topics of boundaries and consent and learn more about it, then I can recommend a few books. Some of them I've spoken about in this video so far. Some of them are new. These include Consent Laid Bare by Chanel Contos, Unf Your Boundaries, Build Better Relationships Through Consent Communication and Expressing Your Needs by Faith Harper, Good Sexual Citizenship, How to Create a Sexually Safer World by Ellen Fredericks, and Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture, which is a series of essays edited by Roxane Gay. And of course, if you have been affected by any of the issues in this video and you are looking for help, or you want to help support organisations which are helping other women, then please know you're absolutely not alone and there are loads of resources available. In the UK, you can get in touch with the Survivors Trust or Survivors Network. There's also Rape Crisis England and Wales, who have a 24-hour support line. If you're in the USA, then RAIN, that is RAINN, is a really helpful resource, and you can also check out the National Sexual Violence Resource Centre. Or if you are from Australia or New Zealand, then I provided a link to a list of resources available on iSurvive, which will take you to different resources for individual places and stuff. They're all in the source document below, so please go check them out if you need to. You can also read Jill Simmon's book, Consent and Memoir, which is fascinating. She looks at like what the experience was like for her as a 16 and 17-year-old girl, how she reflected on it in her 40s when she was still kind of like romanticizing a bit, and now as a much older woman looking back and being like, oh crap, maybe things weren't how I thought they were. It's fascinating. I don't know, I have thoughts on it. I'll not go into it now. Anyway, yeah, but that's about all I wanted to say today. I'm sorry this was a difficult video. I know it was very heavy. I know it wasn't very nice, but if you got through it, thank you for doing this, sitting through this. It'd be great to hear your thoughts in the comments, but as always, please just stay respectful and mindful of others. Be kind, be nice to each other, and yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to help support me and my channel, I do have Patreon, where you can go and see like some extra photos and stuff that I take, like kind of behind the scenes stuff. I do a lot of nature and gig photography that I post over on Patreon for everyone, plus the photos of Kyra and just kind of my day-to-day life. You can also get exclusive stickers and prints and fun stuff like that sent out to you over on Patreon. And ad revenue is always tough this time of year, so having Patreon is just really helpful for making sure I can actually pay my bills and keep making videos. So thank you so much to everyone who's already supporting me over there, and thank you to anyone else who may be considering it. But for now, honestly, the best thing you can do is just keep watching videos, sharing them around, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't, and just know that I appreciate all your support and kindness. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and thank you for taking the time to hear these wonderful women's stories and how brave and strong they are. And yeah, I'm rambling. Sorry. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye.